Now, This Week in Texoma.
Welcome to the program. We're talking about the budget crisis that faces the state of Oklahoma. Representative Dennis Johnson, Republican of Duncan, representing District 50, is our guest, and we want to talk about the challenges that are ahead now and longer term. It's no easy fix. We appreciate you taking the time, because I know that even though we're early in the session, you guys pretty much had to hit the ground running because you knew several months before that the budget crisis was going to be out there.
Yeah, actually, David, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to come on your program. I appreciate it very much. We actually started last year, started having meetings on a regular basis, before we even came into session, because we could see the handwriting on the wall. I mean, when gasoline goes from a $3 a gallon down to $1.25, that's an issue, and it's something that nobody anticipated 18 months ago.
Right.
But it's the new reality, and we're trying to deal with it.
You've been there quite a while in the legislature now.
I'm starting my 10th year.
And so you've been through a handful of these kind of crises.
Sure.
I mean, just last year you were facing a budget hole of about $600 million.
Right.
The mood this year, though, I'm guessing is unlike anything you've seen in your 10 years.
I haven't. Now, we had a slowdown in 2008, a recession, if you will. But this is much worse than what I've seen since I've been there. I talked to former my former seat holder, who's former Lieutenant Governor Jerry Askins, and she was telling me she remembers back right after 2002, after the Trade Center bombings, that we had several revenue failures at that period of time, and she says she feels for us right now, because she says this is at least as bad as that was.
Now, when we've talked about budget problems before, and this is even in just a normal budget year, it always seems to be the last thing you guys settle, or one of them. But part of that, from what I understand, is part of just the mechanism of the way things work in terms of when you get the numbers. So just kind of maybe help people frame why it's going to take a little while to fix this, even though you know that's the biggest fire that's burning. We shouldn't expect something to come out here in the next couple of weeks saying, here's what we're going to do for next fiscal year budget to kind of solve things.
First of all, to get really basic, the legislature cannot appropriate all the money that we expect to come in. Let's just start with a $100 example. If we think we have $100 coming in, we can really only budget $95. So that's what last year's budget was based on. So when we see revenues coming in 3% under what we project, we're still within that 5% margin. And so, but then now we've just recently had another revenue failure. So we're looking at a potential of probably another 3%, up to 3%. You put those two together, that's 6%. Now we're actually collecting less money than we expected to bring in at all. Now, we're talking about the end of the budget year. So the first part of the budget year, we did have some extra money coming in. There was some money in reserves. We're kind of feeding off of that right now. But at the end of the day, we're going to have to really cut back on the amount of money that's in our budgets in the current year. And then moving forward, we're going to have to be looking at a lower budget for next year. We're looking at areas that we have looked at last year as far as excess funds, revenue, or carryover funds, revolving funds that have balances in them. Just yesterday, there was reported that there was $43 million found in the 1017 fund.
I'm sure there were more than a few people that kind of rolled their eyes on that one. I know that I did too, and I really, how can you all of a sudden realize, oh, wait a minute, there is $45 million over here in the corner that we can use. Don't worry about it, schools. You don't have to cut another 20. We found some for you.
Well, we were looking at 19 million cut, but now we're looking at 43 million above.
Right.
Well, that was mainly because I'm speculating, but we have a new superintendent, and they gather up a lot of these numbers to give to the excise board or the equalization board.
Right.
I will tell you, on the House side, we knew that money was there. It wasn't a surprise to us. It was like we didn't know that they didn't include it in those totals. So it wasn't money that was sitting that nobody knew about. It was just money that probably somebody who was a newcomer just didn't think about it.
Some kind of an accounting problem where they just the math just didn't work out because they thought it was headed to another pile.
Yeah, nobody was hiding it. It was there, but through the whole process, it just didn't get noticed initially.
And you kind of touched on it briefly whenever you talked about this current budget year, because that's what agencies and school districts are dealing with right now,
Yes.
those 3% cuts. Representative John Michael Montgomery, Republican of Lawton, was here with us last week, and he had raised the possibility of a special session that occurs inside the existing session. We've
Right.
seen you guys get called for special session before.
Sure.
It's after you gavel out, you come back in June or July, and you deal with one thing, you're there for 2 or 3 days, and then you go home.
Right.
He talked there was a chance that you might be able to do that to deal with some of these impending budget cuts
Sure.
to get us through June.
Well, a concurrent session, which is what you're referring to, would be where we're in session now, but we're having another session within that for the sole purpose of adjusting the previous year's budget. That would allow us to reduce some of the allocations to help mitigate what we call our core functions, so we wouldn't have to cut those as much when we have a revenue failure. Our OMES director, Preston Dorflinger, he is only authorized to make across-the-board cuts. So if he determines, we just announced another revenue failure.
Right.
Last November there was one, and there was a 3% cut. The one that he announced this past week, we're not sure where that's going to land. He did announce there was a failure, but the number is not out yet. We could be looking at another 3%. But that is in the current year's budget, so the agencies that are expecting this amount of money will get a 3% cut off of that after a previous 3%.
Right.
Now, the first couple of months of this fiscal year, they were getting their normal amount. So we're talking about the end of the budget year having those cuts. So it really hurts a lot more when you're taking them then.
And so the idea behind the session would be you guys aren't bound by that idea
That's right.
of across-the-board sequestration,
Yes.
so to speak. You
Yeah.
could kind of pick and choose and say which agencies could stand it more so
Yes.
than another one?
That's right. And we could go back and actually adjust last year's budget, which then becomes the base for this next year's budget. So
And is that likely, or because I know that there's different ways, normally the governor is the one who calls the session, but I guess there are legislative means where you guys could do it on your own?
yeah, the House and Senate can call for it, but they both have to agree. And we have yet to agree on that. It would still be an option for the governor to call for that. Whether she does or whether she doesn't, we're still all hands on deck trying to find out what we're going to be able to do, because with next year's budget, we're going to have a cut. We are $1.35 billion in a hole in this next year's budget.
Right.
So the more money we can find that we can apply to next year's budget, that'll reduce that amount of cut that has to go into place. And one of the reasons it's going to take a while is we're looking everywhere. And so we're going to have to gather all those numbers up and present them, try to get the House to agree, the Senate to agree, the governor's office to agree, and that takes a lot of time. And that's really, David, that's the only thing we have to do before we sign and die, is get a budget.
We were talking about how you had an all-hands-on-deck approach. You're part of a committee that deals right with that. You're right next to the grindstone on that one. So talk about that committee, what its function is, and what you guys have been charged to do over the next few weeks.
All of the committees in the House are what's called policy committees, except for one, and that's the A and B committee, Appropriation and Budget. And we're the ones that help craft the budget. Underneath that A and B committee, there are 10 subcommittees, and I'm one of the chairs of the subcommittees. Our A and B chairman this year has given us all homework to do. Haven't had that for a while. But each one of us has a task of going out and finding ways that we might be able to garner a little bit more money to try to reduce the amount of cuts that we have to do. In my case, I was given the chore, or the homework,
Assignment.
of looking at what we exempt from sales tax. For example, we know that Texas does not tax groceries, but what we don't really think about is Texas does tax a lot of things that we do not tax. For example, oil field services is taxed in Texas. Barbers, hairdressers, a lot of those kinds of services, service-based industries, are taxed in other states, but they're not taxed here. If we could start looking at those kinds of exemptions from our current sales tax, we might be able to make some adjustments there to try to help bring in a little bit of extra money there. That would be fairly painless.
Now, right now, I mean, I'm going to go ahead and play, bad guy journalist here for
Sure.
a while. I'm hearing a Republican talk about taxes.
Yeah.
And so there's going to be some people out there that are going to go, okay, wait a minute, what's this guy's number? Because I'm going to call him up on Monday and tell him not to raise my
Yeah.
taxes. But when you talk about that service tax, that's something that we're just not used to. We know
That's
whenever
right.
the plumber comes out or the refrigerator repairman comes out, then we write him a check and it's for labor and parts and
Yeah.
that's it.
Right.
You also were kind of opposed to that idea, but have
Oh, yeah.
kind of come to a little bit of a revelation as how it might actually benefit some small cities if that were
Sure.
to come back.
As you said, I went into this homework assignment dead set against it and trying to find ways that it's a bad idea. But the more I look at it, when we look at small town Oklahoma, a lot of those services, for example, video stores, you can't find one. Bookstores, you can't find them. A lot of those small town stores that used to be there are gone because of technology. A lot of the states, Texas included, they tax downloadable books. They tax downloadable movies. They tax a lot of things that we don't. If we were to adjust, I'm going to call it an adjustment rather than a cut, but perhaps we could eliminate some of those taxes that we are exempting right now. For example, South Dakota is very similar to Oklahoma in the amount of people that are there, and they're heavily oil dependent. All the demographics are pretty similar, but they tax a number of things that we do not tax. And we just simply did a head-to-head comparison of the things that we do not tax that they do. If we were to match that, and I'm not saying that's what we're going to do,
Right.
but if we were to match that, that would bring in nearly $450 million to Oklahoma. I would also submit that small towns, if we start taxing some of those services are performed in those small towns, and the small town would benefit from that tax. Secondly, we could likely reduce our overall tax rate to keep the amount of money reasonable, let's just say. So yeah, you're talking to a unicorn here, a Republican that might be interested
in taxes.
Yeah.
And whenever you talk about that, I mean, I'm sure your district, I'm saying Duncan, but I mean, there's a large rural element to your district, places
Yes.
like Waurika and Comanche and
Yeah.
Velma, places like that. And you've been hearing all along how that sales tax revenue has either stayed flat or diminished on basic just retail.
That's
so
right.
maybe if those people can kind of start to see the light a little bit, they look at a replacement of revenue rather than a tax.
Yeah, you look at, for example, somebody who is looking to buy a certain product in a smaller town, if they don't find it there, they'll drive or they'll order online. But if you have a refrigerator breakdown or a toilet gets stopped up, you're going to call a local plumber who's going to come out. He's going to provide that local service. He's going to charge you the sales tax on that local service, and then that money comes back to that local town. Where you order something online, that doesn't stay in Duncan, Addington, Waurika, Ringling, all those smaller towns, Comanche. And those towns are gradually losing that tax base that they once enjoyed because of technology.
Right.
So perhaps it's a time to look at modernizing, I'm going to call it modernization, of our sales tax. The whole way we do our sales tax.
10 years in the legislature.
Yes.
So far, so good. I mean, the light is at the end of the tunnel for you, thanks to term limits.
Well, I have one more election.
Right.
The citizens will make that decision this coming fall.
Right.
But it has been a lot shorter than I thought it would be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How does it measure up to what? I mean, you're sitting on your couch 10 years ago, and somebody picks up the phone and says, "Hey, it might be a good idea for you to run," and you say, "Yeah, okay, I'll give it a shot." How did that conversation and your image of what was going to happen measure up to the last 10 years?
Well, the conversation went, "Do you think I'm nuts?"
Right.
And eventually I said yes. And I will tell you, it's been great to serve the public. I started off in city council, was the mayor of Duncan for a portion of the time, and I thought I was done. And then this opportunity came along, and it took a lot of soul searching before I really decided to go ahead and do it. But I will tell you it was the right decision to make. I feel like that I've represented my citizens well. It's been challenging at times, but it's been mostly rewarding. The folks have been great. I tell you that I have the best district in the state because the folks just I get very little complaints, and I try to take care of them as best I can, and they're very grateful, and I'm grateful to be able to represent them.
I'm not going to put the cart ahead of the horse here and presume that you go ahead and win an election, but let's say you do get that other term. It'd be your last one.
Yes.
Do you like the idea of term limits, having been there and seeing how it works, or do you see a benefit in having unlimited servants?
Well, there's a good and a bad part.
Right.
There is some institutional knowledge that leaves with every person that is term limited. But I'll tell you, just in my case, how long would I stay if there wasn't term limits? This gave me a goal to reach that I was grateful for, because I needed that goal out in front of me.
Right.
Otherwise, some guys have stayed many
Right,
years.
right.
Some guys
So you
don't.
did feel kind of a sense of urgency to say, if there's some certain things policy-wise that I want to see get
Oh, yeah.
done,
Yeah.
I've got to do them in a limited time. I
That's
can't
right.
wait until the old codger across the aisle that keeps blocking me till he gets out of the
Yeah,
way.
it's almost like having a profession that you know you're going to have to retire at a certain age.
Right.
It gives you a goal to shoot for. It was similar for me, and I'm glad to have it. I'll be glad when it's over,
Right.
just because I will have finished my course, so to speak.
Right. Let's get back to what you guys are talking about with the budget, and the governor kind of tipped her hand too in terms of what was going to happen in the State of the State address
Yeah.
when she talked about modernizing the tax system and looking at all
Sure.
things out there. You had mentioned the Appropriations and Budget Committee has no real agenda. They're looking for every area
Yeah.
that they can possibly cut. Something that's popped up is adding a gasoline tax.
Gasoline tax. That's an idea that's being floated. First of all, this is still very fluid.
Right.
So we're not talking about things we're going to do, we're
Right.
talking about things we're discussing. But a 1 penny gasoline tax would bring in about $29 million, we found out today.
Okay.
The idea being floated is $3 a gallon gas is much more expensive than $1.25 gas. So the citizen, if we were to put a 5-cent gas tax on there, the citizen wouldn't really feel that. It wouldn't be that big a deal for them.
Right.
And the idea is that as the gas came back up, that tax would go away. It's a temporary tax just while the gasoline prices are depressed.
So the idea would be, if it does hit that level where we're back at whatever the number might be, $2, $2.25,
I'm
whatever.
hearing
then-
$2.25, maybe $2.50.
Yeah, then it would go away. But
That's
again,
right.
it would be relatively, because we see that fluctuation at the pump.
That's
kind of
right.
as it is now.
Yeah.
One day it's $1.25, the next it's $1.35. So yeah, I guess you're kind of used to it. But I mean, that is something that it is relatively painless, and those are the kind of things that you guys are, I guess, considering.
It's
right?
something to talk about, yes.
Right. The governor talked about a tobacco tax.
Right. I don't think that's a great idea. First of all, our citizens, 10 or 15 years ago, maybe 27% of our citizens smoked. Today it's around 17%. So we're asking 17% of our folks to fund the teacher pay raises. A teacher pay raise, by the way, a $1,000 teacher pay raise is equal to about $60 million in our state. So I just don't think that's a good way to fund a teacher pay raise. Is something that if we raise the tax, we may have even fewer people smoking. So we may not generate the money that we think we're going to do.
Right.
Plus, I would prefer that nobody smoked, and the higher the gas,
Right.
or if we become dependent on that tobacco tax,
Yeah.
I just think that's not a good idea. It's not a good policy.
It's
idea.
another shaky revenue stream,
That's right.
and you've already got one when you're
That's-
depending on the energy industry.
Yeah. Well, how about the lottery too? You know, that never came in the way it was promised.
Well, and
So,
Representative Montgomery and I talked about that a little bit last week, and I'm sure your phone blows up with that every time, whatever
Sure.
happened to lottery money. But the idea was that they're delivering the money like they said.
there just wasn't that much there.
And it starts being splintered. It didn't
Yes.
all go to public schools. It would
That's
go
right.
to career tech. It would go to higher ed. And
Sure.
whenever you're looking at a budget in education that is usually in the $2 billion range, if you get 100 million donated, then you're in the really thin percentages in terms of how much it matters. Now, another tax has been floated is by a former governor, current president of OU, David Warren. Talk about that proposal in
Sure.
terms of funding teacher
Well,
pay raises.
his proposal, and they're gathering signatures for a petition right now to
Yeah.
try to get it on the November ballot, is a 1% sales tax to fund education. There's several reasons why I don't think that's a good idea. Number one, in our state statutes, when you give a teacher a raise, it can never be removed. It always has to be there. So you give them a raise, it just continually goes up. I don't think we ought to be dependent on sales tax for that purpose. Number one, it would raise our tax rate to one of the highest in the nation.
Right.
And that's going to affect us economically with businesses and all of that. It would raise that money, but I just don't think it's a good. I don't think it's a good policy to do it on the backs of a sales tax.
we'll see if they do get the petition signatures enough to put it on the ballot, and if they do, then I guess the voters will get a chance to decide one way or another. We've been talking about the budget primarily because if you watch the news, you read the newspaper between now and May, you're going to hear those stories.
What else
about
is there?
Every other day until they get it solved, because it is a giant puzzle. We've been talking about the things you guys are considering. Gas is a possibility, income tax possibility, all of those kind of things out there.
It's all on the table.
It's all on the table. There are some areas, though, that you're trying to mitigate the pain. Is that
Sure.
a good way to put it, maybe?
There's three things that we looked at it as a working group in the A and B committee to try to make sure that we don't affect those at all if possible. Those three things are the 8-year transportation plan, which in 2006 and 2007 we worked very hard to increase the amount of money going to our ODOT to help build new roads and bridges. We had roads just coming apart all over the state, and we're very proud of the fact that our funding has come up tremendously. And there's an 8-year plan that we're right in the middle of. Well, we're probably 5 or 6 years into it now, to help mitigate that problem around our whole state. And there's millions and millions of dollars being added to that each year off the top money. So that comes off for transportation right off the bat. We don't appropriate it. We want to keep that where it's at. Also, the 1017 funding, which is our education funding. The schools and education has come to depend on that. We don't want to mess with that. We want to make sure that is left in place. And then finally, one of our proudest accomplishments, I think, over the last 6 or 7 years has been pension reform. You know, that covers teachers and state employees, and there were 7 pension funds. We were $16 billion in arrears on that fund.
Yeah, that was a huge problem just a few years ago with this session.
And again, off the top, or apportionment money has been thrown into there every year, starting a couple of years ago, and we're now down under $8 billion from $16 billion a few years ago. We really want to leave those things alone.
Now, some of the things that you are going to try to tackle, we talked about education earlier, and this is something that's in your wheelhouse, is trying to come up with ways to mitigate the teacher shortage that we have.
Sure.
Talk about the proposal that you're floating to the legislature this year.
Before I do that, let me just make a quick comment that teachers do need a pay raise. And that's also on the table. We didn't mention it yet, but that is also on the table. If there's any way we can do that, we're supportive of doing that.
Right.
Secondly, we do have a teacher shortage, and we're trying to think of all kinds of ways that we can address that. I have a bill that came from one of my constituents to try to engage seniors, people that are over 65, that have a professional skill. It could be math or engineering or any number of professions, but they don't have that teaching certificate. So they either have to go through an alternative certification process, or under my bill, this would allow those teachers that want to go back to school to get a teaching certificate and be real, so to speak. I mean, there's nothing wrong with alternative certification, of course.
Right.
But someone who just wants to cross all their I's and dot all their T's and make sure it's official. There's some of those people that are OCD like me. They just want to make sure it's all lined up. All those ducks are lined up real perfectly. Well, they can go back to school for the sole purpose of getting those certification classes and have the colleges not charge them tuition for that. And I'm happy to say it did pass out of the Education Committee. It's on its way to the floor for a vote, and hopefully we'll be able to get that to the governor's desk. And
that would just be across the board? I mean, would a school board then decide if they wanted to patch into that, or that'd just be a state law?
It would be a state law.
Okay.
And we don't know, we tried to run some numbers. We don't know if it'd be hundreds or thousands of people that would want to take advantage of that. But basically, these are people who have easily have the training and the knowledge to deliver the information. They just don't have the credentials to be able to teach.
We only have about a minute left. I know that your mind is just going to be blown up over the next several weeks as you guys figure these things out. You've been in this situation before. Give me your sense of optimism or despair. Where do you kind of fit on the line there in terms of how difficult of a challenge this is going to be? I mean, the Constitution says whatever happens at the end of the day, the budget has to be balanced. You guys can't go deficit spending like the big guys do, right?
And aren't you glad?
Right, exactly.
I've always been grateful that that's in our Constitution.
Right.
At the end of the day, I don't despair. It's just a challenge that we will meet, and we will get there. What we're trying to do right now is come up with ways we can raise additional revenue without having to have additional cuts. So somewhere between 1.35 billion and zero is what we're going to have to try to find, and the more we can find to spend, the less we'll have to cut.
Well, I know you've got.
We will get there.
I know you've got a tough chore ahead of you. We have faith in you. You've done a good job so far. So hopefully this will be another feather in your cap. One of those things you can look back in your rocking chair here in 3 or 4 years and say, "Look, I helped fix that one back in the good old days." Appreciate you taking the time. Representative Dennis Johnson has been our guest, Republican of Duncan. Appreciate you taking the time to watch, folks. We'll see you next time.
If you have a topic or issue you'd like us to focus on, please write to the address on your screen or fax us at 357-3811. Or you can email us.